A $0 tax loophole just broke a 90-year-old federal gun law, and the government let it happen. For nearly a century, the federal government controlled suppressors and short-barreled rifles through a $200 tax. But when Congress slashed that tax to exactly $0, they accidentally triggered a massive constitutional crisis. A federal judge ruled that without an active tax to collect, the government has no legal authority to force citizens into a federal registry. Now, with the Department of Justice refusing to block the ruling, the first unregistered suppressor transfers in over 90 years have officially bypassed federal regulators. But this sudden shift has created a highly fragmented legal landscape where your zip code dictates your freedom. To understand how we got here, we have to look at the baseline rules established in 1934. Under the National Firearms Act, items like suppressors and short-barreled rifles were not banned outright. Instead, they were heavily regulated through the taxing power of Congress. For decades, a $200 tax stamp served as the gatekeeper, forcing buyers into a rigorous federal registry. The legal justification for this registry was entirely dependent on the government's authority to collect revenue. However, when Congress recently reduced the making and transfer taxes on these specific items from $200 to exactly $0, they created an immediate legal paradox. Federal Judge Hendricks analyzed this system and identified a fatal flaw. Historically, the government could only force citizens to register these items because it was collecting a tax. By reducing that tax to $0, Congress effectively stripped the registration scheme of its constitutional foundation. Without an active tax to collect, the federal government lost its authority to mandate registration or enforce criminal penalties for non-compliance. Judge Hendricks granted summary judgment to the plaintiffs, declaring the registration requirements unconstitutional for the covered items and issuing a permanent injunction. This ruling exposed a fundamental vulnerability in how the federal government has regulated firearms for nearly a century. By relying on the power to tax rather than a direct ban, the regulatory structure was always vulnerable to changes in tax policy. When the tax rate fell to zero, the entire legal scaffolding collapsed. The Department of Justice argued that the registration system could stand alone as a regulatory measure, but the court rejected this reasoning, holding that the registry was merely an administrative tool to facilitate tax collection. Without a tax, the tool itself became an unconstitutional exercise of federal power. This means that the federal government cannot use its taxing authority as a pretext for maintaining a database of gun owners when no revenue is actually being generated for the Treasury. The decision sent shockwaves through the legal community, as it directly challenged the mechanism that has kept suppressors heavily restricted for generations. The moment the court ordered 7-day stay expired, the theoretical legal victory transformed into concrete action. In a stunning move, the Department of Justice chose not to seek a stay from the Court of Appeals, allowing the permanent injunction to take full effect. Almost immediately, history was made. Gun Owners of America and Silencer Shop executed the first non-National Firearms Act suppressor transfers in over 90 years to gun rights advocate Brandon Herrera and Texas State Representative Wes Verdell. These transactions bypassed the federal regulatory apparatus entirely, occurring without the submission of a federal Form 4, without waiting for government approval, and without entering serial numbers into the federal registry. This historic event demonstrated the immediate practical impact of the court's ruling. For the first time since the Great Depression, citizens were able to walk away with suppressors without the government tracking the transaction through the National Firearms Act registry. The transfers were completed in a matter of minutes, rather than the months or even years that standard processing times usually require. By bypassing the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives registration pipeline, these organizations proved that the legal ruling had real, world teeth. The Department of Justice's decision not to appeal the stay immediately was seen by legal analysts as a tactical retreat, or perhaps a temporary pause while they formulated a broader strategy. Regardless of the government's motives, the window of opportunity had opened, and advocacy groups moved swiftly to establish a precedent. These initial transfers were highly publicized, serving as a proof of concept for the legal theory advanced in the lawsuit. They showed that when the federal government's authority is successfully challenged in court, the administrative state can be forced to step back, even if only temporarily, allowing citizens to exercise their rights without federal oversight. The speed of these transfers highlighted the stark contrast between the traditional bureaucratic process and a standard retail transaction, proving how much the registry slows down the acquisition of safety equipment like suppressors. Following this precedent, Palmetto State Armory, another key plaintiff in the lawsuit, began implementing the ruling at its retail locations. For qualifying buyers, purchasing a suppressor suddenly mirrored the process of buying a standard long gun. Instead of enduring months of registry backlogs, customers simply completed a standard Form 40, 473, and underwent a national instant criminal background check system check. This operational shift bypassed the traditional National Firearms Act paperwork entirely, treating the suppressor as an ordinary firearm accessory rather than a highly restricted device. By utilizing the existing background check system, the retailer ensured that buyers were still legally permitted to possess firearms, addressing public safety concerns while bypassing the unconstitutional registry. This practical application of the ruling showed how the retail landscape could function without the heavy burden of the National Firearms Act. Customers who had previously avoided suppressors due to the long wait times and invasive registration process were suddenly able to purchase them with ease. The implementation by a major retailer like Palmetto State Armory signaled to the industry that the ruling was not just a theoretical victory, but a functional business model. It forced other retailers to consider how they might adapt to this new environment, even as they navigated the complex legal risks involved. The use of Form 473 provided a paper trail for the sale, as required for standard firearms, but it kept the transaction out of the centralized federal registry that the court had declared unconstitutional under the $0 tax scheme. This compromise allowed the business to operate within the bounds of the Gun Control Act while fully embracing the relief granted by the injunction against the National Firearms Act. For the average consumer, this meant the difference between a 10-minute background check and a 10-month wait for a government stamp. The change fundamentally altered the economics of the suppressor market, driving immediate demand and demonstrating how regulatory relief can instantly revitalize an industry that had been suppressed by decades of federal red tape. But this sudden operational shift highlights the fragmented nature of the current legal landscape. The federal injunction is not a nationwide ruling that erases the National Firearms Act for everyone. Instead, it is a highly targeted shield that only protects specific parties involved in the lawsuit, such as members of Gun Owners of America and customers of the specific federal firearms licensees named as plaintiffs. This means that the vast majority of gun owners in the United States are still subject to the full weight of the National Firearms Act. If an individual who is not a member of the plaintiff organizations attempts to purchase a suppressor without the traditional tax stamp and registration, they are still committing a federal felony. The selective nature of the injunction creates a two-tiered system of rights, where membership in an advocacy group determines whether a citizen is subject to federal prosecution. This fragmentation has caused immense confusion among consumers and retailers alike. Many gun owners mistakenly believe that the ruling applies to everyone, risking severe legal consequences if they act on that misunderstanding. Legal experts warn that the protection offered by the injunction is narrow and highly dependent on maintaining active membership in the specified organizations. Furthermore, the boundaries of who qualifies as a customer of the named federal firearms licensees are still being debated by legal teams. This lack of universality means that the federal government can still enforce the registry against the general public, maintaining its regulatory grip on the market while complying with the court's order regarding the specific plaintiffs. The result is a complex legal patchwork that requires careful navigation. To qualify for this exemption, buyers must present proof of their membership at the point of sale, adding a new layer of verification for retail staff. This narrow scope ensures that while the ruling is a significant crack in the federal regulatory framework, it is far from a complete dismantling of the National Firearms Act on a national scale. Furthermore, a federal injunction does not erase state-level criminal statutes. This is why Palmetto State Armory explicitly chose to limit its new sales policy to its storefronts in South Carolina, refusing to extend it to locations in North Carolina or Georgia. If a state has its own independent statutes regulating or banning suppressors, those local laws remain fully active and enforceable. A resident of a restrictive state who attempts to bypass the federal registry using this ruling could still face immediate arrest and felony prosecution by state authorities, even if they are completely immune to federal charges. This geographic disparity highlights the limits of federal court victories in a federalist system. While the district court can block federal agencies from enforcing federal laws, it cannot override state laws that independently criminalize the possession of unregistered suppressors or short-barreled rifles. Many states have laws that mirror the National Firearms Act, meaning they define illegal weapons by referencing the federal registry. In those states, if an item is not registered federally, it is automatically illegal under state law, regardless of whether the federal government is currently blocked from enforcing its own registration requirements. Consequently, gun owners must be intimately familiar with both federal and state statutes before attempting to utilize the benefits of the injunction. A single step across a state line could transform a legally protected activity into a state-level felony. This reality has forced retailers to be extremely cautious, limiting their transactions to customers who reside in states with favorable local laws. The legal risk is not just borne by the consumer. Retailers who facilitate these transfers could also face state-level charges if they operate in jurisdictions with strict local regulations. This creates a situation where a customer's physical location and state of residence are the ultimate determining factors in their ability to access these newly deregulated items. The victory in federal court is thus constrained by the realities of state sovereignty, leaving a fragmented landscape where rights vary wildly from one state border to the next. The silence from federal regulators is perhaps the most volatile element of this unfolding crisis. As licensed dealers begin transferring suppressors without federal registration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives and the Department of Justice have remained completely silent. There are no official guidance letters, no administrative directives, and no clarifying memos sent to the thousands of federal firearms licensees across the country. This regulatory vacuum exists because we have entered completely uncharted legal territory. While the district court's injunction blocks the enforcement of specific National Firearms Act registration requirements for covered individuals, it does not erase the Gun Control Act of 1968. Licensed dealers must still comply with standard federal background check laws. But how these two massive statutory frameworks are supposed to interact remains entirely unclear. Without official guidance, every transaction is a calculated risk, leaving dealers to guess how federal agents will interpret the rules during routine audits. The lack of communication from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives has left many business owners feeling exposed. They worry that a future change in administration or a successful appeal by the government could lead to retroactive enforcement actions or the revocation of their operating licenses. In the past, the Bureau has been quick to issue letters clarifying its position on new court rulings, but in this case, the silence is deafening. Some legal analysts suggest the government is intentionally remaining silent to avoid creating a paper trail that could be used against them in ongoing litigation, while others believe the agencies are simply overwhelmed by the complexity of the ruling. Regardless of the reason, the lack of clear rules of engagement puts the burden of compliance entirely on the private sector, forcing businesses to hire expensive legal counsel to navigate the silence. This regulatory uncertainty acts as a chilling effect on many dealers who would otherwise participate in these transfers, as the potential cost of an administrative error during a federal audit could mean the end of their business. The legal complexity deepens when examining other items regulated by the National Firearms Act, such as short-barreled rifles and short-barreled shotguns. Under federal law, buying a pre-made firearm and building one yourself are governed by entirely different regulatory pathways. The district court's injunction did not block the federal transfer restrictions on complete, factory, manufactured short-barreled rifles. Consequently, major retailers and distributors have confirmed they will not sell factory-built short-barreled rifles without the traditional Form 4 registration process. However, a unique exception exists for those who build their own. Under the terms of the injunction, the federal government is blocked from enforcing the making requirements for covered individuals. This means a qualifying Gun Owners of America member who previously purchased a firearm may be legally permitted to configure that firearm into a short-barreled rifle without filing a federal Form 1. This structural inconsistency leaves consumers walking a razor-thin line, where assembling a firearm at home is legally protected, but buying the exact same configuration pre-assembled from a retail store remains a federal felony. This bizarre distinction highlights the convoluted nature of federal gun regulations, where the physical act of assembly changes the legal status of the item. A consumer who buys a rifle with a barrel shorter than 16 inches from a dealer must wait for federal approval. But if they buy a standard rifle and a short barrel separately, they can assemble them at home under the protection of the injunction. This loophole creates a bizarre market incentive, encouraging home manufacturing over retail purchases. It also increases the risk of accidental non-compliance, as gun owners must carefully document the origin of their firearms to prove they were built rather than transferred in their short-barreled configuration, ensuring they can defend themselves if questioned by law enforcement. This distinction between making and transferring is a classic example of how legal technicalities can create absurd real-world outcomes, leaving gun owners to navigate a maze of definitions where a single incorrect step can result in a federal prison sentence. We are standing at a historic crossroads where a 90-year-old federal system is actively fracturing, but as the legal battle lines shift, the burden of navigation falls squarely on the individual. Bypassing the federal registry is now a reality for some, but a potential felony for others, depending on organizational membership and state borders. Without official guidance from the Department of Justice or the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, every step is a calculated risk. The system is changing, but the ultimate cost of testing these new boundaries remains entirely yours to bear.